We're meeting with Sean Rost of the State Historical Society of Missouri, and we're talking about a famous Missourian. And this is something a lot of people are interested in, but may not know that Scott Joplin, famous composer of ragtime music, we call him a famous Missourian, but where was he born?
So yeah, the one thing that's kind of fascinating about Scott Joplin's life is just that there's so many question marks, and even his biographers have pointed out that even doing extensive research has produced as many gaps and unknowns as confirmations. So for someone that is connected to Missouri and is a famous Missourian, Scott Joplin's life begins really in northeastern Texas. He's often associated with the town of Texarkana, but actually he moved there actually after the town was established. So his early life is really connected with the family growing up there in northeastern Texas. Even his birth date is conflicted. It's often said to be November 24th, 1868, but biographers and scholars have pointed out that that's possibly not true, and that it could be as early as 1867, or even an earlier report in 1868 as well. So even that's unknown in a lot of ways. But he's born in northeastern Texas and eventually settles in the 1870s with his family in the town of Texarkana, right there on the border of Arkansas and Texas.
So, what's his childhood like? Is it full of music, or is it full of work, or what are the circumstances there?
So music plays an interesting part in his life for someone who goes on to compose some of the major pieces of work of the ragtime era. Music is common in his household. His parents knew how to play music on different kind of instruments, and certainly even some of his siblings went on to have musical careers as well. And most people have really attributed his musical origins not only to his family history, but also to a German immigrant named Julius Weiss, who was kind of a local official there in Texarkana, and someone who taught him a number of elements of music and a love for music. Maybe not so much the extensive composition and playing that we know later on in his life, but a familiarity with different types of musics of that era, and even of kind of earlier eras, especially opera and European types of music. And that is where he gets his first real education and learning in different types of music. And eventually he is able to get a piano into his own home. And Scott Joplin, through this purchase of a piano by his parents, or by his mother specifically, is able to then not only play at his mother's place of where she works at in her employer's home, but also now in the home, and is able to kind of give himself his own musical education at the same time.
And a piano at that point in time wasn't uncommon for middle class or upper class people, as I understand it. What kind of gift was this in his life? This must have been a sacrifice.
It was a major cornerstone, really, of the home in a lot of ways. Most scholars kind of attribute it to being a hand-me-down kind of piano, a piano owned by a local family that was then, when they were buying a new one, they gave their used and older piano through purchase to Scott Joplin's family. So it was something that became a key pillar of the home for him to play and learn on. And when we think of the 19th century, in an era before radio and of course before television, music and socializing was the entertainment of the day. So the ability to have a piano and learning on the piano was crucial for hometown entertainment, and also crucial for the life of Scott Joplin.
So this German immigrant introduces him to music, teaches him to play, and does he influence what we would come to know as ragtime, or did Joplin pretty much come up with that on his own?
Well, ragtime was something that was kind of growing and developing in, you could say, Joplin's early adulthood. He is considered to be by many the king of ragtime writing, or ragtime writers is kind of the terminology often given to him. But ragtime was not simply his sole creation. It was something that was in and around his life. So he travels the country quite a bit there in the 1880s, first with a quartet and a singing group where he is kind of the lead vocalist. and he's kind of getting educated not only in the style of music with quartets and shows like that, but with also styles of music in and around the country. So a lot of the origins of ragtime are really placed not only in African American music and spiritual traditions, but also with kind of other musical styles of the day. And often it's been kind of placed in communities like Chicago with the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, which is where Joplin makes appearances at in 1893. In cities like St. Louis, where ragtime really becomes a major focal point of the music scene by the early 1900s, and Sedalia, Missouri, where Joplin lives for a period of time there in the 1890s, where he is producing music that later on becomes of international fame.
How does he wind up in Sedalia?
It's an interesting story, and again, another one of those question marks about his life. Some evidence suggests that there was a family that he knew in Sedalia, and that when he was a teenager, he moved to Sedalia and actually attended a school called Lincoln High School, which was a segregated all black school there in the town of Sedalia. Other scholars kind of dispute this and say that there's no hard evidence to suggest that, but perhaps more so he ends up in Sedalia through his musical travels, and that he would have played in Sedalia at some point in his quartet or in some sort of organized band, and that he would have seen kind of the need for, or perhaps the lucrative options for playing music in the town of Sedalia. And thus, in 1894, he makes his way to Sedalia there and kind of lives there for the duration of the 1890s until 1901, and really gets well connected into the city and into the music scene in Sedalia at the same time.
Yeah, and for a musician who travels and needs to travel to earn a living, that was quite a lengthy period of time to be in one place. How did he really embed himself in the town? What were some of the key points of his time in Sedalia, Missouri?
Well, Sedalia at that point, we think of Springfield as the Queen City of the Ozarks. Sedalia in that point in time was known as the Queen City of the Prairies because it was kind of that western prairie in the state of Missouri. It was a cattle town and a railroad town. It had major railroad linkages to all major portions of the United States. It had the shops for the Missouri, Kansas, Texas Railroad. And it also had kind of the drop off point for a lot of the cattle trails that came up from Texas and from the southwest. So it was a major growing town in the 1890s, about 14,000 people. There's another interesting side story about the fact that Sedalia tried to get the state capital away from Jefferson City in the same time period, arguing that it was a more prominent city that Jefferson City was. So it was an up and coming town. It had a lot of businesses. It had a lot of musical experiences. It had, I think, 3 or 4 music shops or music stores just in that town alone. It had a lot of fraternal organizations, a lot of private industry businesses and such that needed music for performances and for shows. And it had a thriving, entertainment business, what we might call in some cases a red light district in and around the city of Sedalia as well. And through these various entertainment venues and concerts and things like that is where Scott Joplin kind of hones his skills and his experiences as a piano player. He also is a cornet player. He's also a singer. So he's a very sought after musician, not quite getting much fame outside of the city limits of Sedalia at this point in time, but getting notable acclaim not only in various parts of the city, but in 2 major African American clubs in the city. The 400 Club and the Maple Leaf Club, which is later attributed by some to the origins of his publication called the Maple Leaf Rag.
Hmm. Does he meet his wife there in Sedalia? His first wife?
Yeah, it's through these kind of connections early on, through travel and through music, and through even some of his students that he trains early on, that he meets his first wife, Belle, there in the late 1890s. And they have a short period of time together before they ultimately separate. But yeah, his early history in Sedalia is where he meets his very first wife, Belle.
So, what is the trigger for the move to St. Louis? What happens that inspires him to move east?
I think in a lot of ways it is a quick element of fame, although not substantial fame, but also the realization that Sedalia cannot offer the financial support that a musician like himself needs. He gets connected with a man by the name of John Stark in Sedalia, who was an ice cream store owner, a music store owner, a Civil War veteran. And the man who hears the Maple Leaf Rag and ultimately publishes it in 1899, and he gives Scott Joplin a interesting contract in a lot of ways. He gets a royalty off of the sale of the sheet music, which was 1 penny, 1 cent, which doesn't seem like a lot today, but over time, later in his life, it was said that the royalties just off the Maple Leaf Rag could pay for a sizable amount of his income for a particular year later on in his life. So not famous right away, but later on it becomes a sizable piece of music. So Stark moves to St. Louis in 1900, and that's one contributing factor to Scott Joplin moving over to St. Louis. Another one is just simply the rise of ragtime in the city of St. Louis that brings him there as well. So by 1901, he is relocated to St. Louis, and he quickly gets connected with a number of major ragtime publishers, a number of major ragtime musicians in a larger city of St. Louis, which at that point was, the fourth or fifth largest city in the United States. So it was a much more lucrative market where he saw that he could perhaps build his brand, build his music empire, and become a more well-known, house-known name and more successful financially.
And his personal life initially flourishes.
Initially, yes, he has extensive success in St. Louis and publishes a number of major pieces. Even talking to people I know and some of my children, playing bits and pieces of music, even they have heard some pieces of music like the Maple Leaf Rag. The Entertainer is another common one that people have often heard that may not associate with Scott Joplin. And he writes a famous one called The Cascades, which may not be known by so many people, but was a dedication in a lot of ways to the notable fountain at the St. Louis World's Fair there in 1904. So he gets early experiences writing music, publishing music, and even as a kind of small feature performer at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis as well. So initially, he has a sizable amount of success in the city of St. Louis in that larger ragtime scene.
What is there one central piece? You think of pop store or stars or rappers or rock stars. They have this one song that just boom, they explode onto the scene. Did he have the equivalent of that, or was this a slow build?
I think it was a slow build, but I think there's a number of publications that he came out with that people may know better today that may not have been as recognized in his own day. So I think the Maple Leaf Rag is probably the one that people most associate by name with Scott Joplin, although I think the sound and the structure and the play of the Entertainer is much more known to everyone's ears, perhaps than the Maple Leaf Rag is. But there's one that I think is well notable was that he had a kind of opera he produced later on in life that was called, I'm trying to think of the name here for a second. Oh, Treemonisha, which initially was a failure. It was not even produced for the stage. It was deemed to be a commercial failure. He could get no major support for it, and yet, years and years and years after his death, that play, that opera appears on Broadway and actually wins a Pulitzer Prize in the 1970s. So I think that one is probably the most well-known one in terms of major stage production that he wrote. But then it had no acclaim when it first came out.
So he is working, and in his personal life, he also runs into some tragedy, great losses while he's in St. Louis.
Of course, yes. Not only does he separate from his first wife, but their child dies relatively soon in after birth as well. His second wife that he marries dies within weeks of their marriage soon after that. And this is all within the span of, a couple of years after moving to St. Louis. So you suffer through, a separation from a spouse, the death of a child, and then the death of his second wife almost instantaneously. And, in a lot of ways, that's seen as a contributing factor to him ultimately leaving the city of St. Louis is that he suffered through those personal tragedies, but then also, his music is being, published and sold, but it's not being sold as widely as he would have hoped. And that's where he kind of looks to a place like New York City to possibly be that place where he can connect to the larger music scene and become a well-known and well-published artist.
And that's ultimately where he spends about the last decade of his life. What kind of mark did he make in New York City?
Well, he was connected in with again with John Stark. John Stark
Ah,
moves from Sedalia to St. Louis, and then he moves on to New York City as well. And he's kind of has an office in the well-known Tin Pan Alley of New York City, and that's where Scott Joplin gets connected with music scene as well. He tries things like ballets, he tries things like operas, he tries larger types of music, but at the same time, the ragtime musical movement is really beginning to dwindle by this point in time. It has a lifespan that runs about the 1890s to about the 19 teens. So by the time he arrives in New York, ragtime is already starting to decline as a major kind of American musical, you could say, movement or even in popularity. So really, he lives out the last decade of his life in relative obscurity. He dies in 1917. And for many, many years after his death, he actually was living in a pauper's grave, in an unmarked grave in New York City. This major musical giant of the late 19th, early 20th century is largely forgotten. And in fact, he kind of notably said in his life, that no one will remember me while I'm alive, but they'll soon remember me after I'm dead. And that came to be true in a lot of ways. So he dies relatively penniless and unknown in a lot of ways outside of the sheet music that he published and produced and composed.
this is the kind of story that reminds me of the painter. Your painter who toils in obscurity and after death. It's wow. This is a masterpiece, and for a kid. When I was a kid, there was a movie that came out with Paul Newman, and I think for a lot of us, hearing that music for the first time, and like, hey, this is pretty catchy. I like this. That's the thing that happened to him is movies and getting his opera produced really changes how he's viewed years and years after he dies.
Yeah, he kind of had that kind of a postmark. He said, in 25 years after I'm dead is when people will start paying attention to me. And it's really the 1940s, almost 25 years after he passes, that there's kind of a revival and interest in ragtime music. It comes and goes in the 40s a little bit, but it gets his name out there again. The bigger one that a lot of people may be more familiar with is, of course, in the 1970s, when there's kind of a string of major, theatrical releases, major musical productions that are all based around his life. So, the movie The Sting, which wins an Academy Award in 1973, features Scott Joplin music. And that kind of rekindles a lot of interest in that as well. Tremonisa becomes a Broadway play in 1975, wins a Pulitzer Prize in 1976. And then in 1977, Billy D. Williams appears in Scott Joplin, which was a biographical movie about his life. So very quickly there in the span of 5 years, Scott Joplin has gone from this maybe more obscure, maybe largely forgotten ragtime performer and publisher and composer to being featured in major motion pictures, being featured on Broadway, winning a Pulitzer Prize for something that he produced that never got the acclaim in his life that it did in his death.
Hmm. And now in Missouri, there is the Scott Joplin House in St. Louis. It's a Missouri State Park, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And Sedalia has a festival every year to honor him.
You're correct.
He's far from forgotten in Missouri.
Yeah, it seems for someone who spent, roughly, we could say perhaps 13 years of his life in the state of Missouri, there's a lot of Missouri legacies that continue on for Scott Joplin's life. You mentioned there the festival there that's in Sedalia, of course, it's a major festival, a music festival there, and of course the Scott Joplin House State Historical Site in St. Louis is another one that kind of lives on in that legacy of Scott Joplin. So there's many places in Missouri that still remember him. He is seen by many as a famous Missourian, even though he wasn't born or died in the state, but he contributed something to the state that is, I think, long lasting, is that, when we think of the history of ragtime, the cities of Sedalia and the cities of St. Louis are often associated as the kind of epicenters of that ragtime movement and ragtime music overall across the nation and internationally. So his music, may have not have gotten the acclaim in his day, but it lives on across the globe, but really having origins back within the boundaries of Missouri.
And some historians, as I read preparing for this about Joplin, credit him with opening the doors to the development of jazz also and other forms of music. His vision helped kind of spur the movement on of these other forms of what we call American music.
Well, I think ragtime in a lot of ways is a quintessential American musical style, and thus it becomes significant in its influence on jazz later on. Jazz really comes about there. We see it in the 1920s and the 1930s and into the 40s, and of course later on. But really, it comes right on the very heels of ragtime in a lot of ways. So, a lot of those early jazz musicians most likely were listening and studying and composing ragtime as they transitioned and turned it into jazz music. What's kind of intriguing of the fact is that ragtime is not really a style of music originally that was composed for dancing, whereas jazz, a little more kind of associated more with dancing, although some different types of jazz music. But certainly ragtime in its initial form was much more of a something to be listened to than it was something to dance to.
Well, we started this conversation talking about question marks in his life. So I think maybe we can wrap it up with the ultimate question mark. And as I read again about Joplin, it seems there's a question mark about his death too. Is that the case?
Well, and oftentimes what scholars have found in a lot of ways is that, just like his birth date was unknown, there was conflicting reports about when he died. Even his own third wife said he died in 1919. Contemporary reports say it's actually 1917. But it seems like he suffered through a debilitating series of diseases that, in a lot of ways, hurt his ability to compose music and write music, and even to kind of live through his day-to-day, activities in a lot of ways. So, he was someone who suffered in a lot of ways in the latter years of his life, and by the end, an element of dementia had ravaged his brain to a point that he couldn't even remember the music he had composed in some ways. So his death in 1917 was kind of the end of the era, really, in a lot of ways for jazz, or for ragtime music.
All right. Sean, I appreciate your time today and helping us learn about Scott Joplin and the cooperation of the State Historical Society of Missouri on a number of pieces we've done on famous Missourians, and we're going to claim him as a famous Missourian.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.